Hey, it's Stereo Police. It's been a little while since I've made a video. I believe my last video was when I first purchased these Klipsch Cornwall 3s. And I promised in that video that I would do a full review of them. But I needed a little time to get to know them and to get them to break in and get to really fully know their characteristics. And it's been some time now. I don't know how long it's been. I'd have to go back and look at my previous video, but I would estimate a month or maybe more, possibly more. And I've been listening to these Forte 3s as my primary speakers ever since then. Even though my did I say Forte? I meant Cornwall 3s. I'm going to mix up Forte and Cornwall all night, I bet you. Cornwall 3s. And previously I had Forte 3s, and there they are right there. And I noted in the last video that I had no intention of purchasing Cornwall 3s. But very briefly, I was, just as a brief summary, I was in the audio shop. They happened to have Cornwall 3s side by side the Forte 3s. I owned the Forte 3s already, and I loved them. I've done a review of them. They could have been the last speaker I ever purchased, as far as I'm concerned. And I was in that audio shop, and they had the Forte 3s and the Cornwall 3s readily available to switch back and forth with whatever music I wanted. And I made the mistake of doing that, and probably within 5 seconds of the first song and the first switch, I started out listening to music through the Fortes and switched over to the Cornwalls, and boom, I believe I said to the sales associate, "I'll take them." There was a stunning difference between the two. And again, I loved and still love the Forte 3s. But the Cornwalls are very, very different. There's little similarity in terms of their sonic signature, in terms of their sonic characteristics. They're more different than they are similar. And there's a reason for that. And I'll get into that in a little bit. They're not constructed using the same drivers, and the bass alignments are entirely different. And towards the end of this review, I'll get into the similarities and differences between the Forte 3 and the Cornwall 3, and I'll give you some subjective descriptions of the sound of the Cornwall 3s and the strengths and weaknesses of each of these speakers, Forte versus Cornwall. Because I have been able to, that's why I left my Forte sitting right here, because occasionally I will hook them up in front of the Cornwalls and just to listen to them again, try to remember what they sounded like, and then go back to the Cornwalls just to see really what the differences are. And to be quite frank, I would like to keep both pairs of speakers. They're both great. So I love them, and I'll tell you why. But first, just some background information, since I'm kind of doing a review here. I did a little bit of doing a little bit of research. I just want to give you a little technical information about the Cornwalls and versus the Fortes and that sort of thing. So I had a little time today. I did a little research and just a little bit of background first. And this is the part of the video where I inevitably and intentionally weed out anybody with ADD. I've mentioned that before. I keep mentioning it because I do get comments from time to time about the length of my videos, and some of them are pretty nasty, and those are deleted and the user's blocked. And so this part of the video is for you guys who are impatient. Okay, so the Cornwall 3s And this is taken from the Klipsch website. Forgive me, it is Saturday night. I don't know the date. It's Saturday after Thanksgiving, 2018. And I'm having a little wine. That's why I finally have a little time. Family's gone, that sort of thing. So from the Klipsch website, they note that the Cornwall 3 derives its name from being the first Klipsch loudspeaker designed to operate from either a corner or against the wall, hence Cornwall. Okay, so that's where the name derives from. When I was a kid, I never knew that, and I always thought they were named after the county or whatever they call it in England, Cornwall. But not the case. Also from the Klipsch website, initially introduced in 1959, the Cornwall speaker was designed to serve as a larger, full-range alternative to the Heresy when used as a center channel speaker between two widely spaced Klipsch horns. And of course, back in the day, the Klipsch horns were Klipsch's premier speaker, and depending on the size of your room, and because they're corner horns, they have to sit in the corners of the room. So depending on the size of the room, the corner horns, the Klipsch horns, could be spaced really far apart relative to your listening position. And when speakers are spaced too far apart, you begin not to hear a full sound stage. You just begin to hear the left and the right. You know, that the in-between space is not really filled in enough when speakers are spaced too far apart. So you lose sound stage, and I'm assuming imaging as well. And so Klipsch had the idea of coming up with these Heresies and then even the Cornwalls as a center channel speaker. Now that leads to an interesting question, and I don't have all the answers to it, but we're talking about the 50s and 60s, and we're talking about a center channel speaker, but there was no center channel decoding. You know, there were no computers back then. There was nothing encoded into phonograph records, you know, to produce a center channel. None of that stuff. So how the hell did they do it? What did they do? How did the center channel speaker work, and how would it fill in the in-between space, you know? And there were a number of techniques that people were using, and I was wondering what Klipsch was referring to. So I know that back in the day there was a technique, and I don't know how far back this goes, but I remember reading about it years ago, called the Hafler effect, and that was more of a surround sound. That really dealt with coming up with rear channel speakers. And you might want to look that one up. It's interesting. I won't get into that for the sake of brevity. And there was another technique that I've read about in the distant past, where people would hook a center speaker up, and it would go between the positive left and the positive right. So that means that any signals that were in common to both the left and the right would not be produced in the center channel. But whenever there's a deviation from the left and the right, it would fill it in the center channel. So any differences between the left and the right would fill into the center channel. So for example, if you had left and right pure mono, nothing would come out of the center channel. But if you had, for example, a flute or something playing in the right channel, and some of the old Beatles records were way, like they put drums and instruments entirely on one channel instead of, you know, both. So if you had something playing out of one speaker, I'll say the flute, let's say out of the right channel, and nothing out of the left, then you'd have a difference between the positive right and the positive left, and some of that would be produced by that center channel speaker. So that was one technique. And Klipsch had this idea, and this is taken I just printed this out tonight. This was taken from one of the Klipsch documents that they periodically produced. This one here is from 1974, superseding a document from 1971, the Dope from Hope, Arkansas, where Klipsch was founded and still exists today in terms of their heritage speakers. They had this idea of, and I will film this if you want to read. It's interesting. This is just a passage. This isn't the entire document. But what their setup was, forgive me, I don't have a tripod here, I have to hold it, is you have your regular right, and these kind of depict Klipsch horns here, right? So you have your regular right and left channel Klipsch horns, positive and negative. And then what they would do is take the two positives and add them together. Okay? Simply add them together to form a mono channel. It's an old-fashioned way of forming mono out of stereo. So it's to form a mono channel with an equal mixture of the left and the right channel, attenuated a little bit, so it's not at full loudness, and then run that out to an amplifier, a mono amp, and then hence you have your center channel speaker, left plus right. And this wouldn't be as loud as the left and the right, but it would fill in some of that center a little bit, so you wouldn't have that vacant space there. So that's what Klipsch was referring to, I believe, based on this document, when they were referring to a center channel speaker between two widely spaced Klipsch horns. Just, a little bit vacant space there, put a mono in there. You still get stereo because the left and right are much louder than the center channel. It's attenuated, but fills in some of that space. Frankly, I wouldn't want that, but that's what people were doing, I suppose. Okay, so before I get into the review of the Cornwalls, thought I'd cover a little bit, and for here I think I'm going to go put this on a tripod and just cover a little bit about the differences between the various Klipsch Heritage Series speakers, namely the Klipsch horns versus the Cornwall 3s, the Heresies versus the Forte 3s. Let's just briefly talk about the differences. Okay, I had to get a tripod, went to my workshop. Cheers. Alright, so differences. So what I have here, I want to compare these three speakers right here, the Klipsch horns versus the Cornwalls versus the Heresy. The Heresy is their smallest of the Heritage series, their least expensive. Very good speaker, but right off the bat we see frequency response 58 Hertz. I've owned the Heresies. I owned them right before I upgraded to the Forte 3s, before the Cornwall 3s, and I found their bass to be, I found their treble and mid-range to be wonderful, but this 58 Hertz, you'll know it. There was just non-existent bass, in my opinion, just not nearly enough to be satisfying, not nearly enough to be a primary speaker. Whereas the Cornwalls and the Klipsch horns, both, well, I know for a fact the Cornwalls produce very satisfying bass, very deep bass, no problem. The Klipsch horns the same. They're all very very high sensitivity speakers. You need these speakers are all, of course, perfect for tube amplifiers. A 1 watt amplifier could produce, very loud music through these things. They're all very, very efficient. 105 versus 102 versus 99 decibels, 2.83 volts or 1 meter. Some of the most efficient speakers on the planet right now. Crossover points are all somewhat similar. You can see that these are high frequency versus mid frequency. You can see that we have similarities between the Heresy and the Cornwalls, but of course the Klipsch horn crosses over lower, and that's partly due to the fact that the the woofer on the Klipsch horn is horn loaded and it's concealed behind the cabinet. You know, it's not a direct radiator, it's tucked up in there and it goes through a horn. So this is not going to produce, you know, they needed to cut it off a little earlier because it's not going to be able to handle mid-range frequencies. It's not a direct radiator, so they cut it off a little bit earlier. That's understandable. No issues with any of this. We can see. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry for the pause. We can see, let's go down here to the mid and high frequency drivers first. They're titanium. They're compression drivers and they're horn loaded, of course, and you can see that the Heresy and the Cornwall 3 share the same drivers for mids and highs. They're different woofers. You get a 15-inch on the Cornwall 3, and the Cornwall 3 is port slot loaded. The port is a slot at the bottom. The Heresies are sealed, and that's one of the reasons you get so little bass. And the woofer, you know, a 12-inch woofer in a small cabinet that's sealed is not going to produce, I mean, 58 hertz is, I swear it's even higher than that. Bass is non-existent. The Klipsch horn uses the KE33 woofer. Now, by the way, this is the current Klipsch horn. There is a new Klipsch horn that's a new design that may use different drivers. I don't know what's in that. I'm just going with the current classic Klipsch horn. They share the same woofer, okay, as the Cornwall 3s. But the Klipsch horn uses phenolic diaphragms in their compression drivers, whereas the Cornwall 3 uses titanium. Titanium, a very strong metal, it is used in tweeters. Phenolic diaphragms, phenolic, if you've seen that term, refers to phenolic resin. Generally, it's a thermal setting resin. If you want an example of things there are certain countertops that are made out of it, and billiard balls, pool balls are made out of very hard materials. Once it sets, you know, you heat it up and you mold it to whatever you want and let it set, and then boom, it's hard as hell and it won't melt again, even if you heat it up to the same temperature. And phenolic diaphragms it's a material that's been around for 100+ years, and it was originally used in the classic speakers as compression driver diaphragms, and it's carried forth today, and still many compression drivers you buy use this material. But those are the differences. Power handling, the same. Now, this right here, this shows the Cornwalls and the Klipsches. This is identical to what we just saw. Just want to compare with the Forte 3s. Couldn't fit it all on one sheet. Alright, so let's go with the Cornwalls versus the Fortes. You can see that there's a slight difference, at least as stated in the specs, for bass extension. 38 hertz to 20K, 34 hertz. You get a few more hertz. I can tell you from experience, I can't, well, I'll get into that in a little bit, but you can't tell the difference between a speaker that rolls off negative 3 dB between 34 and 38. They're effectively the same. 102 decibels sensitivity, 2.83 volts, 1 meter versus 99, roughly the same. Crossover points, slightly different, no biggie. Now, the drivers used in between the there are no common drivers shared between the Forte 3s and the Cornwalls. The Cornwalls shared drivers in common with the Heresies, but not the Fortes. This is a whole different animal. Has its own drivers, not shared with any other speaker in the Heritage lineup. They are titanium. The woofer is still fiber carbon cone, the same as all the Klipsch Heritage woofers. It's 12-inch in the Fortes, and they still use titanium diaphragms in their compression drivers, but the driver designs themselves are different. You still get 100 watts, 400 watts. This is 100 watts continuous, 400 watts peak. That's shared between the Heritage Series speakers. Okay, so those are the differences on paper. Let me get into a little bit of my subjective review of the Cornwalls. Okay, first let me start out with the construction. Now, in terms of looks, looks is a highly subjective thing. I think they're beautiful with their grill covers on. I'm going to put one on in a minute to show you, to demonstrate something. And I think they're beautiful with them off. I love the classic look, knowing that this was a speaker from 1959, and it still looks like a speaker from 1959, yet it's new. It's got modern, materials, but I love the classic look. It's really cool to know that you're listening to this speaker that is effectively the same, updated but the same, as something that would have been sold in 1959. I think it's just, I like nostalgic things, and that's just really cool. This speaker is large. I don't know if you can get a perspective of how large it is, but it's dominating. I mean, it dominates the room. It's huge. It's 36 inches, roughly 36 inches high, and 25 inches wide. Now, let me get into a couple of, it's got, I can't move this thing, but it's got binding posts for by wiring or by amplifying, which I am by wiring right now. I think the finish looks beautiful, gorgeous. A couple of complaints, not complaints, but nits. I can tell you, for some reason, just like the Fortes, the finish scratches off easily. If you were to rub your thumb kind of hard, your fingernail kind of hard on there, this finish just scratches right off. It reveals the wood color, and the finish is very delicate. It's like almost on the surface, and if you were to scratch too hard, same thing happened when I was removing the grill covers from the, so you can see this or not, right there. That's just me putting my finger there, like that, to remove the grill covers. Just a little bit of fingernail scratch, and that finish comes right off. Very delicate. Got to be very careful. That is a nit from me. I don't like that. Second thing is that, these are fairly expensive speakers, and I think they're nicely constructed. They use medium density fiberboard inside with a veneer, a real wood veneer. They're matched. The veneers are matched left and right. And it's decent quality. It looks, they are hand built. They're built by people, not machines, and you're going to see little imperfections with anything hand built, little idiosyncrasies. I have no problem with that. I think they're well constructed, but one of the things that's weird is these grill covers are attached with magnets. You can see these are little rare earth magnets right there, very strong. And they attach to these fasteners right here, all around. And yet, down here, they stick these little, you can buy these at a hardware store, right? They're little plastic dimples with an adhesive backing. I doubt that's going to last a lifetime of the speaker without falling off. And there's 3 of them here. And then there's 2. There's one there at the very bottom, and then one there. And I'm guessing what they're there for is to support this larger area of the grill cover so it doesn't warp inward or something like that. I am not sure why they're there. I didn't read anything that I'm supposed to remove them. And these 2 at the bottom, I think, are to ensure that when the grill cover's on, it stays, because they're fastened by magnets, that the vibration doesn't cause it to sort of go down and leave a gap up here. So the bottom of the grill cover bumps up against those things. I'm guessing. That's weird. I would prefer, for the quality level of the speaker, to have some kind of real hardware, some kind of screwed in rubber bumper there and there and there, instead of these little plastic, buy a pack of 20 of them for $1.98 at the hardware store. They're just not going to last. I just know they're going to fall off. Look at that. That one's shit. That one's already coming off. Now, am I wrong? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm supposed to take them off when by the speaker. I didn't read that anywhere, but that's just crap. If anyone knows if you're supposed to take these off, I don't. Maybe I didn't read the owner's manual enough or something. But these little cheap ass things kind of drive me up the wall. I don't even know if they're needed. Maybe I'm all wrong about that, but they're on both speakers. Okay, so let me set this. I'm going to set the camera down just for a second while I put the grill cover on, snap it into place. Okay, and I'm not going to call this a nit, I'm just going to call it a fact. Okay, these grill covers are flush with the wood here. Okay, so you cannot use your fingernails or your fingers to remove them. And I can tell you that they really need to be removed. They attenuate the high frequencies significantly. And they really need to be removed when critical listening, let's say. They really have to be removed. But they're hard as hell to get off, and I don't think you want to grab the Klipsch emblem here. I don't think that's secure enough to be used as a removal tool. I just don't believe it. So you need some kind of tool to get them off, and I happen to have, this is one of my old electronic tools, like got a little pointy screwdriver thing on the end, a scraper, and then on this end it's got a little hook like that. So I just use this to slightly go in there, pull it out like that, very gently, it's not doing any damage, and grab it with my finger and pull it from there. So these grill covers are hard as hell to get off without that tool. The Fortes, on the other hand, the grill covers are not flush. They stick out just enough where you can get your fingernail there and pull it off. And the final nit that I have, rather than nits, I really ought to call it a suggestion for improvement, is that I feel that these cabinets, the panels are so large. Look at that, the rear panel is just huge. And I don't feel that they're braced enough. You know, when you're listening to a bassy song and you come up and you feel these panels, they're really vibrating a lot. And a vibrating speaker panel is a speaker driver. It is producing sound. And that sound may or may not be in phase with the sound coming out of the woofer and or the port, and it may just be smearing everything. Now, it's not going to be a significant amount of sound, but it's still sound. And I feel that these side panels, and especially that rear panel, really need some form of bracing internally to prevent that amount of vibration. But on the other hand, these are large speakers and those panels are large. So I just wish there was a little bit better internal bracing. Alright, so I've covered my suggestions for improvement. Let me get into the sound. Okay, so I'm going to try to be really succinct here. I'm not making this into a multi-part video, with the exception of I might do a part 2 with sound samples from both the Cornwalls and then the Forte 3s. I think that would be really interesting, just to see if I could attempt to capture the differences between the two, because they are very, very different. But anyway, let me begin with the mids and the highs. My first thought when I first heard these speakers, both at the shop as well as when I first hooked them up at home, is that these speakers have to be the lowest distortion, most effortless, natural sounding speakers I've ever heard with respect to the mids and the highs. And that's what really struck me. Now, you know, distortion, or when we talk about total harmonic distortion with respect to amplifiers, or intermodulation distortion, or transient intermodulation distortion, when we talk about amplifiers and preamplifiers, distortion is a figure of merit that they often give us to look at. And, you know, it makes a difference to some degree. You know, it gives you an indication of the capabilities of an amplifier. But modern amplifiers, whether they're integrated circuits or discrete or tube or what have you, they're all the distortions are less than less than 1%, often less than 0.1%, sometimes 0.00 something percent, right? So you can't really compare. It's not a huge factor in terms of, it's more about listening to the amplifier. Whereas the weakest link in terms of distortion in your system from beginning to end is your loudspeakers. Yet we're not treated to specifications regarding distortion on loudspeakers. If you were, you might be appalled. There are techniques for measuring distortion of loudspeakers. But yet it's just not given. What we're given is a frequency response graph. And yes, a frequency response graph of a speaker does give us the ability to compare how a speaker accentuates or de-accentuates certain frequencies in the audio spectrum relative to others. Doesn't tell us anything about the transient capabilities, and then there are time domain measurements we can take and things like that. But in terms of distortion, speakers are I'll repeat it, are the biggest producers of distortion in the audio chain. And I'll say this, and you can do the research on this, the lowest distortion speakers you will ever find are horn loaded, compression driver horn combinations. There are many reasons for it. I think I covered this a little bit in my previous videos about compression drivers and horns. But the lowest distortion you will ever get will be out of that. Horns, compression drivers will kill any dynamic cones or domes in terms of distortion. In part, and there are many reasons for that, in part due to the efficiencies of coupling a compression driver to the air. Okay, as I mentioned before, a horn is basically an acoustic transformer that tries to match the impedance of the driver itself, the compression driver, with that of the room or the air. Domes and cones don't get that benefit. And also, one other reason for that, and I'll move on here after that, is that because they're so efficient, compression drivers, the actual diaphragm itself, really has to work or move very little to produce the same amount of sound as the same level of sound, SPL, as a dome or a cone. And the less movement, the better. The less chances of breakup and other problems you run into when cones or domes start moving too much. And there are other reasons for it too. And to segue back into what I was saying, I sensed that lack of distortion. It was just, and you can sense it when you turn these things up. It's remarkable. Okay, I wish I had a good pair of dynamic speakers here, with domes and cones, to compare with these. When you reach a certain level, when you start turning up music, if you want to hear something that's equivalent to live, which is nothing wrong with that, I do that a lot. I crank these things up. With regular speakers, non-horn loaded, you reach a point where things start sounding harsh, and you think, well, that's my ears, that's the way the ears start shutting down and the muscles start tensing up to protect the ears and that sort of thing. But that's not the case until much higher SPLs. You're hearing distortion. And whereas these speakers, when you start to turn them up, they get loud, but they are just the same. I mean, they're just crystal clear. And, it's very hard to describe. It's a very strange thing, but only horns can bring that to you. And the dynamics, that's a whole different thing. The dynamics of horns are just beyond reproach. Okay. So that was my first thought. My second thought was, with these speakers, and to some degree with the Fortes, you get all of the low distortion, super high dynamics of horns without any horn coloration. No accentuation, no ringing, no artifacts. You really don't hear horns. You don't hear that cupping your hands around your mouth thing. You don't hear the bullhorn sound. They just have all the benefits of low distortion, natural sounding speakers without any of the drawbacks of horns, and there are some pretty bad horn speakers. You can really tell they're horn speakers. You don't get that with these. Not even close. The highs and the mids are as fine as I've ever heard. That's one of the things that sold me on them instantly. Now, in terms of the bass, okay, these are very, very tricky. These were, to me, very tricky speakers to place in the room. Now, this is room dependent. I can only speak to my room. This may vary with different geometries of rooms, different sizes of rooms. But I had a much harder time finding their proper positions than I did with the Fortes. The Forte 3s are, a 12-inch woofer, and they have a big 15-inch passive radiator on the back. Here with the Cornwalls, we've got a 15-inch woofer with a slot. Okay, that's the port down there. It's just a slot. Classic kind of a port, the slot. And they were very tricky to place, and I finally ended up, I think, where I want them, and I'll get into that in a minute. They're very close to the wall, slightly towed in. So they ended up close to the wall, slightly towed in, and this is just a quick diagram that I sketched out a few seconds ago about my listening position, where I found it to be the best. And again, if the edge of the paper is the wall, these are close to the walls, just slightly towed in to the point where the axis of the speakers coincide. Okay, the normals to the speakers, a line perpendicular to each speaker, would coincide roughly 10 feet beyond my chair. And I like the triangle right here. Okay, the distance between the speakers is roughly the distance to my chair. My chair's a little further out. And I found that to be the perfect position with respect to imaging, soundstage, and overall tonal accuracy, let's say. And I'm very happy with that. But it took me a long time to figure that out because I wanted to place them where the Fortes were, which were a little further out. And that wasn't working. It wasn't working with respect to the bass. The further I pulled these out, I'm getting into something I was going to get into later, but I'll talk about it now. The further I pulled them out from the wall, the deep bass, the deepest bass, the sub bass, diminished significantly. Just a few inches made a huge difference. And when the sub bass diminished, it seemed to really accentuate the mid bass a lot, to the point where it was kind of annoying. It was just too present. Accurate, but accentuated. So when I finally got them back against the walls, which I've never had speakers this close to the wall before, but hey, they're corn walls, right? Everything just seemed to, the tonal accuracy just fell into place, and everything just fell into place. The deep bass is there, nothing seems to be way too accentuated, and so that's the placement. But I've never, in every speaker I've had in the past, if you placed them that close to the wall, the bass would be too boomy. Not with these. So when Klipsch says they're meant for the walls, they're meant for the walls, believe me. At least in my room, okay? A lot of these things are extraordinarily room dependent. Okay, so bass slam. That's that feeling you get, for example, when the kick drum hits and you feel it in your chest. Sort of. You can feel it rather than hear it. These are, again, the kings of that. And that's you know, when you have a muddy, sloppy bass alignment with a crappy woofer, you get sort of a muddy, sloppy bass, and you lose that slam. That slam is all blurred together, and it, you know, you get some, you can feel bass, but you don't get that sharp snap of the slam. You get that here. These woofers are amazing in that department. Yes, accuracy is there. These are very, you know, when I sit there and focus on the bass, and beautiful, beautiful, wonderful bass accuracy. I still feel, even though this is my best placement, I still feel there's a little accentuation somewhere in the mid bass. It's the only place on the audio spectrum that I feel there's an accentuation. It's not a boominess in a inaccurate, piss poor alignment kind of way. It's just an area where there's just seems to be a little too much bass energy. You don't hear it on every song. You just hear it on certain songs where the bass guitar or what have you is tuned to that frequency. I still get that sense, but again, I'm still, you know, I'm still listening. These things are still breaking in. That's another thing that I want to mention. I'm not a big believer in equipment break-in. I've never been able to hear the difference. For example, with my beloved Yamaha AS1100, I've never heard a difference, a change in sound during a break-in period. Not a huge believer in that. But with respect to woofers, I am, because they are mechanical devices. They have, you know, they're basically, a woofer is basically a reciprocating motor. It's a motor. Works on the same principles as a rotating motor, except it reciprocates, it doesn't rotate. And the springs, okay, there's two sets of springs here. There's the spider on the inside and there's the surround on the outside. Those things are stiff when they're new, and the speakers become more compliant when they break in, because those springs are going to break into a point where they reach a stable area. You know, their materials like that are always stiffer when they're new. And as the speaker becomes more compliant, the bass will become a little deeper. You can check out the Teal small parameters and run a speaker simulator to actually see that happening. I did notice a significant amount of break-in with respect to these woofers. They are way deeper now. They sound, I'm not going to say better. You can hear the deepest notes of the bass, the sub bass, a lot more now than when I first bought them and took them out of the box. So I feel there's a significant break-in period when you buy these things with respect to the woofers. I hear no difference between in the tweeters and mids now than I did a month ago. But the bass, quite significant. As far as toe in, I just covered how I have them towed in. Their axes meet behind my listening position by about 10 feet. I found that soundstage and imaging, okay, when you tow them in too much, you know, for example, if you were to tow them in so the tweeters are directly facing you, they sound good, but you feel like you're listening to two different speakers. You know, there's the one on the left, there's the one on the right. When you tow them out so that they're actually parallel to the wall, in other words, there's no toe in, the soundstage opens up, but the imaging, okay, the soundstage becomes huge. It's actually wonderful, but the imaging suffers a little bit. And I found with the slight toe in that I have, I achieved that perfect balance between soundstage and imaging, and it's just awesome. It's to me, they're so good. It's mind-boggling sometimes when I listen to music through these. Lights are down, you know, no other sensory disturbances, and you're just listening, and some things happen in the music that you're just stunned that you're hearing that in the way that you're hearing it. The dimensionality, it's wonderful. Okay, there's two other effects that I want to cover that are something interesting that these speakers absolutely excel at. Okay, so I just had to hit pause for a minute. I needed a refill of Chardonnay. Forgive me. Jars. Okay, so these speakers are astonishing in a couple of ways. Now, granted, this is subjective, of course. That's pretty axiomatic, but I don't know. It depends on the kind of music you listen to, but I suspect for most of us there are occasions we want to do a little critical listening, and then sometimes we just, sometimes you want to hear background music, and sometimes you want to hear a live concert. And quite often when I'm down here, I want to hear things at concert level, and I want to feel like I'm there. And I'm not talking about way too loud. I'm not talking about party loud and stuff your ears loud. I'm talking about pretty damn loud, but comfortable, where you can feel the bass, where you can really hear the dynamics. And these speakers, I might have mentioned this in my first video about them, maybe not, but sometimes I'll put on a good live recording, and one example was Stevie Ray Vaughan that I listened to. It was one of his live recordings when I first bought these speakers, and I cranked them up to concert levels, and these speakers are just remarkable. Now, first of all, the dynamics are just can't be approached by any ordinary dome cone speaker. And it's so hard to describe, I won't be able to. You'd have to hear them. But the dynamics are so lifelike. Of course, the sound is just, phenomenal in terms of tonal balance and, bass impact and all that I mentioned. But unlike any other speaker I've ever heard, if you were to sit here in a dimly lit room and maybe even have your eyes shut and you had these speakers cranked up to concert levels, the first thing that came to mind is, my God, there is a wall of sound. And I mean a wall. You cannot distinguish the left speaker from the right speaker. And they seem to extend from the corner, or the sound comes from the one corner of the room to the other. There's still stereo imaging and all that stuff, but it extends the length of the room and it's seemingly the height of the room. It's just phenomenal. And I don't know what it is about these speakers that make that happen. The Forte 3s could not do that. Forte 3s were great. I love them. But they could not achieve that wall of sound. That's the best way I could describe it. It's just phenomenal. Cannot hear the fact that you're listening to two speakers. It's just huge, this wall of sound. It's colossal. And it's amazing. And it's so lifelike. So during those times when you really want to hear a live concert in your house, you've got it with these. Perhaps that's room dependent also, I don't know. But they work perfectly in that regard in my room. And the second thing, and I just alluded to that a minute ago, is the lifelike live dynamics. These speakers are effortless. When you crank them up to concert levels and you start to internally cringe, like, oh man, I'm pushing my speakers too hard. Am I going to blow something, or am I going to hear some distortion, that's going to happen? And you kind of get that with regular cone dome speakers. You reach that point where things aren't sounding right. They get compressed. The sound gets compressed. No compression. None. It just gets louder, but it's still the same crystal clarity, the same dynamics. There's no compression. These speakers are just not even breaking a sweat in that regard. And they're just phenomenal. So if you like to turn things up loud, these speakers are kings of that environment. I mean, just fantastic. So overall, I'm getting close to the summary here, I think. Jotted down a few notes to make sure I'm not veering off too far and droning on. Okay, so just to sum things up, overall, I think I mentioned at the beginning or towards the middle of the video what areas that these speakers could use a little improvement on. And if I had to choose one thing out of all those little nits, like the finish and the grill covers, you know, being challenging to remove, and the thing I would prefer the most would be that these cabinets be better braced. They're very lively. But on the other hand, when I sit here and listen to music as I'm about to do tonight, I just lose that thought, and the speakers sound fantastic. The mids and the highs are just, I don't know the words for it, but they're accurate, scary, lifelike. You know, when you're listening to something at a reasonably high level and you're enjoying the music and little things happen in the sound, and it just makes your heart skip a beat sometimes. These speakers are so good, so realistic, and thunderous bass with songs that have it. I mean, and just kick you in the chest when it's built into the song, of course, you know, the thump and the slam factor, and just the amount of sound that these things produce are just stunning. Now, let me just give you a comparison between, a relative comparison between the Cornwalls and the Fortes. I can do this because I own both speakers and I substitute one for the other. So, and I don't have any other speakers here to compare them to right now. Soundstage and imaging, two very important things. Forte 3s were and are excellent. Cornwall 3s even better. Live experience, I just covered that pretty extensively. Excellent, of course, for the Forte 3s. Beyond excellent. Unbelievable. Unbelievable for the Cornwall 3s. Mids and highs, accuracy. You know, how lifelike is it? Okay, this is just a relative comparison. So relative to the Cornwalls, relative to the Fortes. If the Fortes were an 8, the Cornwalls would be a 10. Just wow. Low frequency bass slam, I would say the Cornwalls a 10, Forte 3s a 9. Pretty close. Now, low frequency extension, the deepest of the notes you can sense. Okay, and maybe even also low frequency accuracy, realism. I'm going to give that to the Forte 3s by 2 points. There's just something, and I've gone back and forth and listened, and for some reason, I don't care what the specs say, the spec sheets say, the Forte 3s seem to go a little deeper, and they seem to be a tad more accurate in the bass department. That's a perception I have now at this point in time. Maybe that'll change later, but I still have that perception. Overall, Forte 3s are excellent, and I would say the Cornwall 3s are beyond excellent. I would take them over the Forte 3s any day. One more thing I'll say about these two speakers, as a bonus, as a benefit, as a plus, the Cornwall 3s, the mid-range and the tweeter are at the perfect height relative to a regular chair. They don't need to be elevated. The Forte 3s need about 3-inch risers to get them high enough to where they're acceptable. You know, if you want that tweeter and mid-range roughly at ear level, which with these kinds of horns you really do, unless you tilt them. So there you have it. Final thoughts. What I'm going to do is in the next video I make, I'll give you sound samples. I'll set up my microphone like I did in the last video. Try to give you the best samples I can given the equipment that I have. And I'll do a comparison. I'll pick a song, something that YouTube won't give me a copyright violation on. I'll try to pick some song with some energy in it. Something that well recorded. And I'll play them through the Cornwalls in their current position, and then the the Forte 3s. I had a pause, I just sneezed. Oof. Yeah. Okay. But my overall impressions, to sum things up, is if you ever get a chance to hear these Cornwalls or the Fortes, either one, but the Cornwalls are just remarkable. I would take them over the Fortes any day, despite what I feel is the Forte's slight edge in the bass department. It's not that the Cornwalls are lacking, it's there. I just think, let me just draw this out, and that would be the last thing I do. Okay, so this is one relative to the other. I'm going to draw a frequency response. Just picture a frequency response, and let's say 20 hertz, and let's say 20 kilohertz. So if I were to say that the Forte 3s, was flat, I'm just going to call it flat for comparison. Okay, then I'd say this is the Forte 3. Then I would say the Cornwalls would look something like that. Okay, I would say there's a slight, I would say there's just slightly less of the deepest of the deep bass. I sense it. Not that the Cornwalls are deficient, but slightly less. And I'd say there's something being accentuated in the mid bass. I don't even know what frequencies to tell you that would be at, but there's something in the bass that's accentuated in the Cornwall 3s. Maybe a little too much. It's not, now that I've got the right placement, it's not. And also one other thing, maybe perhaps my ears got used to the Fortes, and maybe they were deficient, and maybe the Cornwall 3s are more accurate, but my ears are getting used to it. I don't know the answer. But one relative to the other, that's how they are. But overall, I'd say these Cornwalls are super highly recommended. I think that, yes, they're expensive, and they're huge. You got to have the right room for them. But in my opinion, they're a damn good value for their price. I think the value factor is there, and they're just they do everything I ask them to do and beyond. Every kind of music I listen to, I enjoy through these. They never disappoint, and they can produce a concert in your room unlike any other speaker I've ever heard. Of course, the Fortes can do that to a certain extent, but the wall of sound that I mentioned earlier is just unbelievable that you get from these things. It's an effect that I've never heard before. and the dynamics and the lack of compression at higher levels, unbelievable. These are thoroughly modern horn-loaded speakers, and I highly recommend them. Listen to them, but I'm telling you, these things are great. And I feel like I'm a little bit of I won't say a hypocrite, but I feel a little weird saying this now because I know I did a review of the Forte 3s a year ago or so, and I said that similar things and that they would be the last speaker I ever owned. Well, that's one of the problems is you know, it's everything's relative, right? So I heard those. And believe me, I've heard some pretty bad speakers where I'd say, nope, no way. All the time. So it's not that I'll just give a good review of any speaker. These Klipsch Heritage Series speakers are very special. They're all very good. But when I made that mistake of hearing the Cornwalls, I had no intention of purchasing side by side with the Fortes, and 5 seconds, boom, I want them. That's how good they are. So highly recommended. Look forward to the sound samples that I'll be doing, the music samples through the Fortes and the Cornwalls in an upcoming video when I have time to do it. Takes a lot of time to do that, to get my mic set up and get a house that's fairly quiet. And but anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope that you found this video to be informative. And till next time, ciao.